Hi, my name is Mina and I am a photographer from Hamilton. Right now we're at my new show. It's a photo project that is completed by myself and Bryce Kanbara. The title of the show is Tesatawiyat.
I identify as Ojibwe. All of my life experiences have made an impact on my life. All of my relations and all my acquaintances have influenced me for good or bad. My children and family are my true purpose. I identify with being Indigenous. Specifically, I am a Mohawk, Turtle Clan, and I am a Six Nations band member. I never lived on Six Nations, but my mother grew up there, and I lived really nearby in Brantford for a large majority of my life. My father is from Italy, so I identify with both cultures. My parents have been married for over 40 years, and we all still live in Brantford. I'm really fortunate to be working in an Aboriginal health center for the last 7 years. It is very fulfilling to work in the area of Indigenous healing and wellness, and there is a fertile opportunity to think creatively about your healing and wellness journey. I think this experience has made me acutely aware that there is a marked difference of worldview in the way we conceptualize things. And I have grown to feel fiercely appreciative of that difference in the minutiae of everyday life. I am native from Six Nations, Tuscarora. My family left Six Nations and went to the States, and when I was 13 we moved to Niagara Falls, back to Six Nations when I was 14, and off to Niagara Falls again when I was 19. I learned to speak Mohawk at school. At 20, I moved to Hamilton to experience something different. My uncle was the greatest influence on me. He took me to the Longhouse with him. They spoke Mohawk there, performed ceremonies and dances from 9 a.m. to 2 or 3 p.m. Women sat on one side. I haven't been back to the Longhouse for 11 years, but I may go back one day. My daughter Shantae speaks some Mohawk, and she will inherit a house on the reserve when she is older. As a child, and even now, I saw a young girl who was and is Mohawk, Turtle Clan. I thought I was special because I was the only Indian around in my neighborhood. As a woman, I still see a proud Mohawk woman with much to learn about my heritage. My friendship with Ruth M. has been a 20-plus year friendship that started with a simple hello. We have been sisters/family since that day we met in the parking lot. I was parking the van, and this car parked beside me. This short native lady comes around the side of my vehicle, introduces herself, and tells me where she lives on the second floor. She lived down the hall from where I moved in. Asked me if I was native, and I told her yes, I was Mohawk. Ruth was happy about that. She was Lower Cayuga. Tells me to come down for a coffee when I get settled, which I did a week later. I want to be like Ruth when I grow up.
I personally self-identify as North American Indian. My experience with my father was exceptional. We traveled the forest together and foraged and hunted for various plants and food. Dad was also a producer of native medicines. I put many miles on my moccasins to forage for the various plants my father would require to make his medicines. From him I've learned how and where to forage, what time of year to forage the forest for the miscellaneous plants required, both for food and medicinal purposes. I thank my dad tremendously for this plant education I've received from him. Native. I left home at age 16 from Six Nations Reserve, about 30 miles south of Hamilton. My first stop was to my sister Grace's home, Fort Erie, Ontario. Both my parents were okay with the move, providing I got a job and didn't bum around. There were 5 kids, 3 adults, and a 2-story home. Herb, my brother-in-law, got me a job ironworking with him. It lasted over a year. A mix of cultures was my best education. There was no judgment from anyone. It was great.
I self-identify as Native, although my ancestry is Métis. I do not identify with the French. The culture of Aboriginal people speaks to me in a way that the white culture does not. I do not feel that I belong to or in the white culture, but whenever I am in the presence of Aboriginal people, I feel I am home. Every Native center I walk into, every powwow I attend, every women's circle, drum circle, anything Native, I feel as if I have come home. Just being near an Aboriginal or Native person tells me I am a part of something. The event in my life that impacted me in a huge way is the following. I was 11 years old and pregnant, and visiting the Peterborough Zoo with my family. I bumped into some people who turned out to be native. We chatted while my family tried unsuccessfully to get me to come away from the natives. We continued to chat, and they inquired in a very gentle and loving manner as to my well-being as a mother-to-be and my age. They are the only people during that time of my life to treat me with concern, care, respect, and to not make demands about how this happened that I could not answer. They also did not blame me, nor did they show me anything other than unconditional love, totally unlike the people around me. In some ways, it is this unconditional, non-judgmental concern for a child victim that taught me that Aboriginal people are far less critical and judgmental than any other group of people. This way of being continues to this day. It is how I try to live, to show concern, develop understanding, show understanding, and express acceptance for situations that are beyond someone's control. I also understood at a young age that all things have spirit, and this was made clear to me when I stepped onto the Red Road in 1998. My natural understanding of the earth and world was confirmed as accurate. I arrived home and have been welcome in every Aboriginal community that I have been in. At this time, I choose to self-identify as Anishinaabe Ojibwe, or First Nations with mixed ancestry. However, the way that I have chosen to self-identify has shifted over the years. Prior to 2011, I was unable to register as a status Indian due to a section in the Indian Act that did not allow First Nations women who married out to pass on status to their grandchildren. On the contrary, First Nations men who married out kept their full status and were able to pass it down to their grandchildren. Although the amendment to the Indian Act, known as Bill C-3, made efforts to fix part of the discrimination against First Nations women and their descendants, it granted people like me, one of the grandchildren, an inferior level of status compared to First Nations men and their descendants, which still to this day does not allow us as First Nations women to pass Indian status on to our descendants. Self-identification for many of us is rather complicated, since it is not only an evolving language that we must maneuver, we must also make efforts to determine where we belong in terms of government policy and Indigenous community membership. The person who had the greatest impact on my life was a Métis professor, Dr. Daryl Racine, whom I met while working at Brandon University. Daryl made me realize that opportunities and new experiences are all around us. He guided me to enroll in a master's degree program and later a doctorate program in the field of education. Daryl made me realize that through education, that we as Aboriginal peoples can begin to make greater change by offering input through our knowledge and expertise, inspiring policy changes and leadership reform. My grandmother is Mohawk. Our ancestral lands are in Lac de Deux Montagnes, Quebec. Her great-grandfather was an Indian trapper and was part of the fur trade in Quebec. Her maiden name is Laforce, but the original name of the Laforces was Otikiote. They changed it for better trading relations with the French. Her family is also Scottish, and I identify with being Métis because of this historic union and my mixed heritage. I have worked as an Aboriginal educator for the past 2 years. In my job, especially when teaching Aboriginal students and Native Studies courses, you get asked a lot of questions about your cultural background. I usually am pretty good with these questions as people are naturally curious. However, I still remember being asked the question, "How much Indian blood do you have?" I felt discouraged and sad that someone feels that that is a necessary and an acceptable question, or to quantify my abilities and knowledge based on my blood quantum. I have light hair and green eyes, so people expect me, like all other natives, to fulfill a certain stereotype. After that, I swore I would never answer that question again, and I felt I needed to do everything I could to support my students' identity and self-esteem, so that one day they would feel that they didn't have to answer that question either, and be ashamed of any part of their heritage. My children and I are a part of the Algonquin First Nation. from the North Bay Mattawa area. We are registered members as a part of a sovereign nation, non-treaty, which is not recognized with federal status. I identify as Algonquin Anishinaabe Kwe, though I am from a mixed background. My mother comes from a British-Scottish heritage. My father is Algonquin, French-speaking, and was born in Bonfield, Ontario, just outside North Bay. I was born in North Bay, and my 2 oldest children were also born there. My 2 younger children were born in Hamilton and in Burlington. Growing up, my family moved nomadically, almost seasonally, all across Canada, looking for work and for peaceful living. We lived rurally in many communities in Alberta and BC. Sometimes we lived outside, sometimes in rented houses. My father worked many jobs, in carpentry, gold mining, even driving a Zamboni in a hockey arena. In the 1980s, my parents built a log home in northern BC, just outside of Fort St. James, which is where I collected most of my childhood memories. We lived off the land in harmony with the wilderness that surrounded us on a little farm. We attended ceremonial gatherings and participated in dancing and community celebrations with many different First Nations communities across the country in my lifetime. We attended ceremonial gatherings and participated in dancing and community celebrations with many different First Nations communities across the country in my lifetime, but I feel a deeper connection with the land in northern Ontario, the place of my birth. Lake Nipissing is the source of many stories about thunderbirds, Benesiwag, Nanabuzho, and Nokomis, and the Wendigo, and these are the stories I share with my children. The story of Sky Woman, Gizhigokwe, the mother of the indigenous people of the Turtle Island, is the first creation story in a series of paintings I completed as a visual artist during my own exploration of my patrilineal roots. I wanted to connect visually with the stories my ancestors told over time immemorial, and create a voice in my time on this earth in retelling the stories. I want my children to know the stories and to tell their children. I want the language to continue, for the ceremonies to continue. The last painting I created was a story my father told me about loss, reconciliation, and thankfulness. That happened last spring at the change of the season into summer. It's called The Deer, the Raven, the Eagle, and the Coyote. We are all part of an ongoing story, and all of these stories have a place and a purpose. Bringing them to voice helps us all to find moments of sanctuary in our urban centers, where we can easily become lost in our jobs, our financial burdens, and in the busyness of our daily lives. They remind us that we are all a part of something bigger, something timeless, and that we are important. Our lives matter. We all have an indigenous voice in us, a voice within our spirit, rooted in the earth by a place and time, to our ancestors, to a greater understanding of what it means to be alive. I hope you will also continue to tell your story. Chai Miigwech. First Nations. I'm keenly aware of the struggles and obstacles my grandmother and then my father encountered as direct or indirect results of their being Indigenous. Poverty was certainly one of those, but there were others. I'm also aware that the cycle of poverty would not have been broken as it has been without a lot of hard work on the parts of those who came before me. As a child, I never had any sense that there was any restriction on what I could accomplish or experience, and I give the credit for that to my parents. I identify as Aboriginal North American Native. I have dual citizenship and can live and work in either country. When my parents died, I was put up in foster homes. My mother was Native, my father German. There were other Aboriginal children around when I was growing up in Fort Erie, but I never did hang around with them. I hung out with the non-natives. When I was a teenager, something triggered it off. It was in me. The teaching was already there. I went to socials in Buffalo, and I knew the dancing already. Something pulled me in. My children went to Mohawk immersion at Six Nations. I'd always lived in Niagara Falls and came to Hamilton last year.
I identify as First Nations because we were the first ones here. I self-identify by knowing my clan, Bear, having a spirit name, Bluestone Cloud, knowing the songs, ceremony and powwow, and language, Ojibwe. These are the 4 gifts that we were born with before European contact. I am still working on my language. It was at a family wake 21 years ago when I was 30. Before that, I grew up as an urban Indian in Toronto, didn't know anything about my culture. But I just loved being around my people. When I moved to Parisien, I went to powwows, but didn't understand the meaning behind them. I learned about my clan, Bear, got a spirit name, became educated. The drum was a big influence. Now my identity is strengthened by going to ceremony, participating at powwows, dancing and drumming, educating myself about the history of Indigenous peoples and treaties, truth and reconciliation of residential schools, and intergenerational effects. And yes, I would share my journey with Indigenous and non-Aboriginal. My birth family prefers Indian, but I refer to myself as Native. I think it speaks to my sense that Canada is my home, and despite where I end up, always will be, and that my heritage has been a part of Canada since long before Canada began. I was adopted by a white family when I was 7. When I was 4, my adopted mom took me to see the renowned chief Billy Diamond speak. She took me to meet him afterwards, and my mom says that he looked pained to see a Native child not with Native parents. Reflecting on that story almost 3 decades later, I became all too aware that there are many Natives who feel that their culture has been taken from them, and in many different ways. It's caused me to be aware that I am a product of 2 very different worlds, Native and white, and that I then have a responsibility to try to bring healing and closure to the often wide gap between cultures.
I'm Ojibwe and a universal child. My son Xavier is Cree Ojibwe. The one who stands out is Josephine Mandamin, an Ojibwe woman who walked around the Great Lakes with a copper pot to draw attention to water. I met her through Ontario Native Mothers Association. I asked her to give me my spirit name. You need to have a connection to the spirit world, and they can't identify you if you don't have a spirit name. I had tried to distance myself, pushed it away, but gifts came with the responsibility of accepting the spirits. Easier to be on the red road than not. I self-identify as Anishinaabe and Cree. My family's traditional territory is in the Hornpain area in northern Ontario, and I am a member of the Long Lake No. 58 First Nation. The interaction between my identity and education has made an impact on my life. Growing up in Hamilton, I was either the only or one of a handful of Native students in school. I was often singled out by teachers to speak on behalf of Native culture and peoples, even though the Hamilton area is not my traditional territory. Sometimes that made me proud, but many times it was uncomfortable and I was embarrassed. There were times when I took initiative to share my culture in school, but it was later exploited by teachers or mocked by students. In high school, I was interviewed by a researcher who seemed surprised when I told her that I had wanted to attend university ever since I was a little girl. She seemed disappointed that I didn't have a sad story that would fit with her research project. I felt like maybe I should have made something up so she could feel satisfied. Today, when I talk with many non-Native people, and I happen to tell them about my education, many act surprised or overly impressed. That too feels embarrassing and awkward. Their comments suggest that they didn't expect a Native person to be educated and have a professional career. These experiences remind me that our society has biases around who gets access to and who benefits from education.
1. I was born to a Scottish father and a Native Indian mother. I am a half-breed. The Native side didn't accept me being Indian, and the white side didn't accept me being white. It seemed that most people called me a dirty Indian. I am glad for my Scottish relatives. Only cousins are left, and we are very close. I have very few Native relatives, if any, that are left, but through friends in the Native community, I have happily learned much about being a Native. As I matured, I self-identified myself as an Indian, but that has transitioned in being a medicine man. There are many types of medicine men and medicine women. There are teachers and healers, mental, physical, internal, spiritual medicine men and medicine women, or just people who listen, or feed someone, or are kind to their fellow man. I am a medicine man who can grow medicines, tobacco, sage, cedar, for the community, and I am a medicine man of the good smile and good heart who tries to do things with helpfulness and compassion of the heart. 2. In the 90s and early 2000s, we were in a group called the Healthy Aboriginal Men's Circle, which met every Wednesday at the Hamilton Regional Indian Center. We are still part of this group, but it is in a different format. For an Aboriginal man to be healthy, he must have a community which includes women and children, so this is what our group included. This group was about Native teachings and everyone helped out. There were teachings about language, clothing, crafts, and food. We would usually share a potluck meal. Through this group, there were many people who were borderline street people, and the support that they felt here helped them. One example that sticks out is when the whole group got together to make a drum. In some Native teachings, the fire is the good in your heart, and the drum is the heartbeat. It took almost a year to make this drum. We started with an old drum frame that was falling apart. It was about 30 inches in diameter and about 20 inches high. First, everything had to come off the frame. That was done carefully so it wasn't damaged. We got some moose hides from a friend in the country. In return for the hides, members of our group went to his property and chopped wood and helped out. We had to soak the hides, dehair and stretch them, and had to re-glue the frame. Some of us glued birch bark all along the sides of the drum. On a beautiful summer day, many of us got together in the backyard of the Native Center. First, we had a potluck meal. The kids played in a small swimming pool. The adults took turns watching the kids and working on the drum. Putting the drum together started by taking a smelly skin out of the soaking fluid, laying it over the drum frame and cutting it to size. We had to do this twice for the top and bottom. There were holes punched in all around the edges, and sinew was woven into these holes to pull the top and bottom together. This sounds easy, but it was a long process where everyone worked together. The drum had to dry and the sinew tightened for several more weeks, and then we feasted the drum with corn and fish and meat and berries. This was a giving of thanks, which is also part of Native tradition. We seem to often run into friends from this group who have taken control of their lives and are helping others now. When you accept and learn about your heritage, you can accept yourself. As I said, this group is still around, but in a different form. We mainly now like to go to an occasional group that is out of the Dwa de Desnia Aboriginal Health Center and continue participating in drumming and learning and teachings.
We refer to ourselves as either First Nations or Native people. Growing up as a small child, my cousins always called us white because we did not live on the res, so I had to point out to them that we looked just like them, so after that they never had to call us something again. As for Richard, he lived in Hamilton and was not allowed to learn his Native heritage.